Greetings, my fellow knights, and welcome to Good Night Tales. This is a place of imagination and wonder, where every tale invites you into a world of chivalry, mystery, and adventure. So take a moment to settle in and join me as we begin another tale. The tale of Eliduc is a medieval Breton lay written by Marie de France. It tells the story of Eliduc, a noble knight torn between love, loyalty, and honour. At first, Eliduc is married to his faithful wife, Eliduc, but while serving abroad, he falls in love with a young princess named Eliduc. This creates a deep conflict, his devotion to his wife versus his passion for the princess. Through trials, misunderstandings, and even tragedy, the tale unfolds with themes of fidelity, sacrifice, and redemption, and tonight I will share it with you. Let's begin. Chapter 1. A Letter and the Turning Tide. Before the sea ever spoke my name, I lived by hedgerows and oak smoke, and the quiet law of my own valley. This is how I was first drawn away. The morning the letter came, the hall smelled of beeswax and damp wool. A pale new light lay across the trestle tables like a folded cloth. I had been listening to the hearth settle and pop as if it still remembered the night's embers, when the door ward lifted the latch, and a gust brought in the cold and the messenger with it. His boots were dark with road mud. He bowed a little stiff, and held out a strip-sealed parchment that carried the faint salt-stung smell of a coast far from ours. "They asked for your hand," he said, his breath ghosting in the cool. He meant my handwriting, and also my oath. The red wax bore a device I did not know. A slender fish turned upward, a star above it. I am called Eliduc. In the valleys where I was born, I served with a steadiness that pleased some and troubled others. For a time I had been asked gently enough to rest my sword and give the court a quieter picture of me. I had taken the counsel as it was meant, but a warrior at a standstill begins to hear small noises loudly. So when the letters crackle, the waxes shine, the messenger's patient stance filled the room. I felt something like a breeze in a long-closed place. Eliduc came in as I broke the seal. She had a way of entering, not with startle, but with the surety of someone who knows the weight of her own steps. The morning took to her cloth, the colour of winter berries at her throat, hair bound back in a simple coil. She had been my wife for years enough that our speech carried many times unspoken through a glance. Her eye flicked to the parchment, then to my face. "News," she said, not a question. "It seems," I answered. The parchment rasped softly when I unfolded it. My palms were calloused, and the skin made the faintest sound over the page, like a whetstone over steel. The hand was formal and steady, a scribe's work, a king to the west, ruled by law and storm, pressed by men who mistook greed for counsel, asking aid of a proven knight. Not for long, the letter insisted. There would be honour, a purse, and a place in a small, neat retinue, until his quarrels were straightened and the fields lay undisturbed again. Our hall carried the scents of our life. The rushes newly laid, bread cooling on its cloth, the clean animal smell of the hounds sleeping under the benches. I could hear the pigeons murmuring in their cote beyond the courtyard. I could feel the letter's weight, which was little, and what it promised, which was not. Eliduc let the silence extend, and in it our life seemed to set itself out like objects on a table. Her place near the window with her needlework, the small nick in the beam above the hearth, where I had once hung my sword carelessly and repaired both wood and habit afterward, the orchard that would be misted with blossom soon. She reached for the letter, and I gave it to her. Her fingers took it without tremor. "Go," she said after she read, and her voice was the softness of a cloth laid over a shining blade. "Not because I tire of our quiet, because you have been set to stillness too long, when I know your mind moves like a current under ice. You will come back steadier, or know you chose well. A summons is not a chain but a road. Take it as such." "It will be the sea," I said, hearing the gulls already in my thought, though we lived far from their scolding ranks. I have never written a line on the air over water, only roads and glens, the heavy earth. We will put you in God's hand, and the hands of men who know what to do with sails, she replied, and then her mouth quirked. And we will set aside your passage in our ledger as a business of the house. I am practical, my lord. I have chickens to count and tile to mend. You will not have me standing in a window for 16 days counting the gulls. I laughed, and the sound felt clean. Outside, a creaking cart went by, its wheels chuckling over the uneven yard. The messenger shifted his weight and did not look at us, kindly giving us our piece of mourning. Tell your master I will come, I told him, with a small company, not a herd to eat his fields bare. He bowed again, relieved perhaps to begin the ride back with an answer that could warm him despite the wind, and he left a dull mark of mud on the flagstones where he turned. When the door latched, the room seemed to settle into a new shape. For a time we spoke of particulars to anchor what felt vast. The steward to be told, the stores to be counted, which men would be asked to ride, which horse would take the road better than another. Gildecue's fingers moved over a small board where she kept her sums, tapping a smooth pebble over a knot she'd worn over years. The small sounds of it soothed me. Numbers are a sort of prayer when your heart is tugged by weather you cannot see. When we had enough lists to satisfy the part of us that believes order can make the day's shape certain, we walked the orchard. The grass there held last night's wet, and each step brought up the smell of soil. On one of the branches, a frost-tinged bud held a drip of water that gathered and let go. It fell soundless to the moss at the roots. My father once told me, I said, that if a leaf falls on your hand in an orchard, you will travel before it goes to fruit. Your father had a talent for making omens from the world. She smiled. We shall see if the trees care what men plan. I did not say that as she spoke. A pale leaf loosed and sailed down to catch in the small ruff of my gauntlet. I stood without moving until it slid off. If she saw it, she said nothing. There is grace in a person's choice not to name what your heart already feels. By noon the yard had a soft industry to it. Men I trusted came in from the outbuildings and the hedges, drawn by the mute language of a place readying itself for change. Mark with the scar along his jaw that made his expression always a little rueful, even when he was happy. Alan who could put a hand to a horse's flank and still its skittishness. Yvonne with a complaint for every chore and laughter folded into each complaint. We gathered by the trough. The water there looked very green. I said the word, and the men's faces shifted as a field does when wind passes. Some had hunger in their eyes, some relief, some a tightening at the corners of their mouths where wives and children hid. Only those willing, I said, as I always did. We will ride light, and we will return when it is proper to do so. When the afternoon leaned toward its edge, Gildeluc brought out a length of ribbon the colour of summer evenings and pressed it into my hand. Because you do not always see what is yours when you look toward the horizon, she said. Tie it to something that moves with you. I slipped it round my sword hilt, beneath the guard, so that when I drew it to practice in the yard, the ribbon whispered against the leather. The noise it made was less than the sound of a moth's wing, but to me it was the loudest thing. Each pass through the forms wore the worry from my shoulders, muscle reminding mind of simple, honest tasks. Step, turn, balance, yield. Night fell hushed. Our hall held its warmth longer than the yard, and the beams overhead remembered the sun in their resinous sweetness. A hound lifted its head and pressed it into my knee. I gave him a piece of bread and felt for a moment the heavy comfort of a creature who asks nothing but your hand above his eyes. We did not say much in the last hour before the lamps were put out. Gildeluec sat at her work and began a pattern with blue wool, the colour of shallow water over bright stones. The thread lay across her finger and made a small steady line through the cloth. I watched the line take shape and thought of the way a ship's wake rights itself on the sea and then disappears. The way of all men's passing, visible, then folded back by the world. When we lay down, the linen smelled faintly of lye and lavender. The window's latch ticked very lightly as it cooled. Sleep took me one piece at a time, the feet, the hands, the eyes, and then it returned with a gift. I dreamt of a road that became a river, that became a glittering band of fish, all swimming in the same direction. scales like hammered coins catching the light. I put my hand among them and felt them slide past, all muscle and silk. Somewhere a bell tolled, as if over water, each note rounded by distance into something like a heart's own count. I woke before dawn to the quietest hour. The yard lay in a blue dimness. The sky to the west was still the colour of wet slate, but to the east a faint line had begun, a shy pale where day would put its first hand to the world. I stepped outside, the flagstones cool under my feet, and breathed. Somewhere an owl made its last small inquiry, and then was silent. I could taste the hint of salt on the air that our valley should not have had, as if a messenger more sure than paper had already begun to arrive. We would ride to the coast by noon. A hired ship would wait, low and patient in its berth, its ropes speaking to themselves with each lift of wind. I stood and watched the breath rise from me and vanish into the quiet. The ribbon on my sword stirred. In the orchard unseen, a drop of water gathered again and let go. The first lark lifted, invisible in the dim. Its song unfurled, a lithe thread thrown up into the paling sky. For a moment, listening, I felt the simple weight of my choice sit well in my hands, and beneath it, like a current in a river, there was something else, a sense of a door opening far away, and of something on the other side waiting for me, or for the person I would be after the sea named me. The tide, somewhere beyond my knowing, was turning. Chapter 2. Salt Wind and Sealed Wax. I had been a loyal knight in Brittany, but whispers had begun to thin the air around me. On the morning the sea first called my name aloud, a rider found me by the lower gate with a letter sealed in green wax. The rider's horse steamed in the cool light, and I could smell both leather and salt, as if he had galloped along the very edge of the tide. For Sir Eliduc, he said, and the seal gleamed like a leaf. I, Eliduc, felt the wax between finger and thumb smooth, faintly perfumed with resin, and told him he'd done well. He drank from the bucket I set out, and I carried the letter inside, where the stone kept its own quiet, like a chapel that never closes. The hall was half lit, tapestry shadows fluttering when the door shut. My wife was already there, a candle near her hand, her hair unbound as she worked at mending a sleeve I had torn on a thorn hedge days before. Eliduc looked up and smiled, the kind of small, steady smile that softens sharp thoughts. She did not ask whose seal I bore, only set aside her needle and thread and patted the bench. "News?" she asked, voice low enough to keep the house still. "A seal from across the sea," I said. Even speaking, it spread a chill in my chest, room for the wind to pass through. "It smells of ship's tar." She folded her hands and watched as I warmed the wax in my palms, admiring the imprint before I broke it. An oak, small and square, roots like a net. The parchment rasped as it uncurled. Letters crowded it in a good hand, asking for a sword and a name. In a far court, a ruler beset by his neighbours wanted a champion, wanted me, because word of my work against raiders and in keeping the marches had crossed the water. The letter spoke of honour and reward. Beneath its smooth words I heard something else, a thin plea, the way a gull cries behind the wind. Eliduc listened while I read aloud, the candle's flame making a bell of light between us. When I finished, I did not fold the letter. I let it rest upon my knees, reached out to trace the frayed edge of the mending in her lap. Beyond the walls came the hush of the orchard, winter bare and smelling of damp bark. The stable flicked ears at it. The sea's breath was in the morning, though we were a ride from the shore. "There are seasons," she said at last. "The field lies fallow and gathers strength. Our king's favour is weathered right now. You have not changed." "I have not," I said, though my hand betrayed me and went to the old scar near my ribs, a line like a question. "Yet staying makes me smaller each day. I do not like to leave you. Do you remember the spring we planted the rosemary?" Her eyes tipped to the window, where you could see the clay pots lined like faithful soldiers. "The plant that took root is stronger. The sprig we broke and put in water named the whole kitchen. We will both remember. You have given your honour here. Give it where it is needed. Do not let envy choose your path. She said my fear without making it heavy. I looked back at the letter, at my own name written in that other hand. In that line of ink I saw a road. Wet grass, the shadow of my horse, the glow of another kind of fire. The old warmth rose in me, the matter-of-fact readiness that had sat behind my calm in every skirmish, that held my sword level, even when I was tired and mud was in my boots. The readiness was not straining like a hound. It was more like the tide, returning without hurry. "Will you come down to the chapel?" I asked. I should answer. We walked along the corridor together, the stones wearing their chill, as they always had. I could hear the servants stirring in the kitchen. The scent of baking was a comfort, yeasted and soft. Outside, the air touched my face, not cold enough to bite, merely clean, and birds were beginning to ask their small questions in the hedges. In the chapel, our breath made the candles tremble. I knelt, and she knelt beside me. The floor was rough-hewn, the grain of prayer had worn it smooth. I offered the decision we had not yet spoken aloud, and beside me her shawl brushed my sleeve like a benediction. When we rose, it felt as if something in the day had clicked into its notch. Back in the hall, I called for ink. The quill's tip hesitated and then flowed. I wrote of service freely given, of my readiness to sail when the wind turned, of the men I would bring, and the terms that kept my honour clear. I sealed it with my small signet, the hound and the sprig, and gave it to the rider to deliver. He smiled as men do when their road is already chosen for them, and I pressed a coin into his palm. "Eat first," Eliduc told him, as if he were a son, and he did, gratefully. That was the shape of it. One letter that asked, one letter that answered, and two hearts that accepted what would follow. After the messenger left, the house seemed to draw a longer breath. We walked the inner ward, and I spoke with my captain about provisions. He was a narrow man with a hawk's patience. Together we counted the spears and clips of mail, touched the seams of the boat cloaks to make sure they kept their purpose. The smell of oiled leather rose up, familiar as an old tune. In between, I found my hands doing smaller work. I rolled my travel cloak, the coarse wool scratching my knuckles, and put beside it the little wooden saint that had always hung above our bed. Eliduc brought me a length of blue ribbon, faded soft by years. "For luck," she said, threading it through the hilt of my dagger so that it would be with me every time my hands moved to defend. I tucked into a pouch a stone from the stream, pale and smooth, the weight of a favour and a memory. We spoke not of danger, but of practical things. She showed me the new place she'd found to store dried apples, and we agreed on who would watch the fields while I was gone. I gave the steward a nod that said he had my trust, and his shoulders loosened in relief. In the stable, my horse tossed his mane, and I pressed my brow to that broad forehead that smelled of hay and warm animal. He had carried me through bog and bracken, and would carry me now to the shore. His breath made a cold dot on my cheek. "Your smile is different," Eliduc said, standing in the doorway where dust drew slow motes in the light. "Less polite," she said, and her gesture was a curious little half-circle, as if the word were a bird that might fly. "More like you." We ate early, simply. Pottage, bread, a wedge of cheese whose rind flaked under the knife. The room was easy with quiet. From the courtyard came the creak of the well rope. Above, a rook went clattering, and then settled again, embarrassed in the bare ash tree. When the sun set into mist, I left my chair, and went to the door, and stood with the cold on my face, and the smell of damp earth rising. Somewhere out of sight, a fox moved through bracken, steps careful and sure. The stars came in ones and twos. Before we slept, Eliduc took my hands and turned them over as if to read them. The lines there had to do with old use, not fortune. She pressed her mouth to my right palm, and then my left. A blessing without words. "Go when the tide draws out," she said. "Do not fight what carries you, only steer." "I will write," I told her, and we knew that ink could not ferry every feeling, but it would be a bridge. At dawn, our house was a hush of breath and sleepy embers. The sky had the first whitening you can taste in your mouth, like clean linen. I could hear the long, slow roll of the sea, though it was still distant. My men gathered in the yard with their sacks and easy jokes. Salt already lived in their hair, because they too had been thinking ahead to the shore. My horse stamped. I stroked his neck, and then stepped into the saddle. The leather squeaked. The girth held, snug as a vow. We rode out, the gate lifting behind us, chains grating in a voice that I had grown to know, as well as any steward's. A thin frost silvered the low grass. It cracked softly under hoof, and made a music that only lasted a minute, then gave way to the wooden sound of the road. The hedges showed last summer's nests, neat little woven bowls now empty. A heron lifted from a ditch, slow and composed, and went away across the fields, toward light that collected where the land fell off into sea. When we crested the last rise, the ocean was there, flat and changing, iron in its calm, green in its shallows, breath for ever moving. The harbour below held its few craft close, hulls dark and beaded with last night's dew. The masts made patterns against the pale sky, like ink strokes on parchment. Gulls circled as if the air were a hidden ladder only they could see. I paused and turned to look back. The line of our roof, the chimney's faint smoke, the thin rimes of field walls in the distance. The ribbon at my dagger stirred its own small way, blue thinking of sky. Eliduc would be standing at the window, I knew, not waving, not weeping, simply watching, the way she watched weather, and made use of what came. I touched the letter I had answered, now folded and tied at my belt, and let the salt wind set its taste in my mouth. The decision sat steady beside my breath. Ahead, a ship's white sail idled, lifting and falling, as if practicing for a longer song. And somewhere beneath that quiet, I heard all the unheard stories that live between coasts, waiting for a name to cross them. Chapter 3. A Ribbon in the Mews. I had crossed the sea to serve a king who was not my own, carrying more salt in my cloak than coin. Afternoon light followed me up from the harbour, all glare and glint, as if the city itself were fashioned from water and sun. Red tiles stepped down to the quay as orderly as soldiers at drill. The streets smelled of hot stone and figs, of tar and pitch, and faint beneath the green iron scent of the tide. I led my horse slowly, letting him nose the air. Banners hung from the eaves, deep blue marked with a white stag, and I knew I had come to the right court. I'd heard in the last market town that this king kept his gates open till dusk, and his accounts honest, and that his daughter slipped from her chambers each morning to the mews. Her wrists and words both light enough for hawk and handler alike. The tale made the road feel shorter. A steadied creature is not easily spooked. Neither, I hoped, was I. The palace sat where the city rose highest, its walls pale as bones laid bare by the sea. I passed through an arch carved with vines and fruit, where a steward in a linen cap stepped forward, his expression composed in the way of men who make order from the day's many edges. "You come on good wind," he said, eyeing the salt line crusting my sleeve. "You will wish for water and a bed. The king hears petitions at dawn." His courtesy sounded like a blessing. I gave him my name, the one that bound me to the vow that had led me across the water, and he inclined his head as if the syllables meant something to him. Perhaps they did. In small courts, a story runs quickly like fire through dry millet. He led me through breezy colonnades into a quiet guest chamber that smelled faintly of beeswax and thyme. I drank, washed, and traded the creak of my leather for a softer shirt, the weave still rough enough to remind me that comfort was a borrowed thing. Above the courtyard, bells told a brief evening measure. I should have lain down and closed my eyes, but the open window breathed a garden scent into the room. Crushed mint, wet earth, feathers, and the hum beneath my ribs refused rest. "May I walk?" I asked the steward as he turned to go. "The inner grounds are open until the lamps are lit," he said. "Keep to the paths, they will keep you safe." He left me to my steps. The path curved under orange trees whose leaves whispered when the wind touched them, a sound like fingers on pages. A fountain blinked in a white basin. Somewhere nearby, a whistle rose and fell, followed by the soft clap of wings. The hawks were being settled. I had learned long ago that while a hall shows a king's power, a muse shows his patience. You cannot command a hawk to trust. You can only be steady, offering your wrist again and again until wildness chooses your balance. The muse was long and cool, its shutters angled to let in the gentler light. On perches, bundles of feathers watched me with bright gold eyes, heads turning sharp as flint when I passed. The air held the clean musk of straw and the metallic tang of the bird's breath. A girl stood with her arm raised, gauntlet dark against her pale sleeve, a bell-laced jess whispering against leather, as the merlin upon it shifted and settled. She was not a child, not a queen, but that hushed place in between, where whatever comes next begins to show in the shape of a gaze. "You favour the quiet corners," she said without raising her eyes from the bird, and though her tone was light, it was not idle. The merlin leaned into the pads of her glove, then hopped to the block at her feet, bowing its head as if from courtesy. She released the anklets and knelt to check the leash. Her hair was bound simply, dark against the pale line of her throat, a few strands playing loose, as if unwilling to be kept. "I favour where skill is practised," I answered. "It steadies me." "Then the muse is kinder company than the hall," she said. "Here truth shows quickly. A hawk in poor hands will tell you before the first day is done." She straightened and met my eyes, and there was nothing frivolous in her looking. It reminded me of clear pools in mountain streams, how they show a thing as it is. Only then did I think to bow. "Eliduc," I said, my name feeling both like a door and its key. "I know," she said simply. "My father's men spoke of a knight from across the water who rides as if he were listening to what the horse asks. I wondered if a man could be told by how he held a rein." She gestured to a perch. "They say you come with a vow. Take care where you set it down. Vows leave their shape, even after they are folded away." The merlin clicked its beak softly, as if punctuating her words. "I am Gwenloir," she added then, almost as an afterthought, though her name carried the calm of someone well made for her place. A strand of ribbon, pale blue, drew a soft line from her sleeve as she turned, the colour of sky seen in snow. "I came to offer my service," I said, hearing how ordinary that sounded after so many miles. "At dawn, if the king will have it." "Dawn is a good hour," she replied. "Everything honest admits itself at dawn." She lifted her bare hand, and the merlin stepped onto her fingers with a delicate confidence that made me think of trust as a creature that can be taught. The bell chimed once, silver and brief. A boy emerged from a shadowed stall to take the bird, his movements practised. The girl Gwenloir drew the blue ribbon from her sleeve and weighed it in her palm as if measuring something I could not quite see. "Will you take this?" she asked then, lightly enough that it would have been easy to refuse. "Not as a favour, as a reminder. It would be poor manners to refuse the muse," I said, and held out my hand. The ribbon was cooler than I expected, smooth as lake water, and when she set it down, the middle of it warmed almost instantly under my skin. "A reminder of what?" I asked, not because I doubted her intent, but because I wanted to hear what she named. "That there are places in this city where a soft touch does more than a loud voice," she said, tying the ribbon to the guard of my sword with nimble fingers. It looked strange there, a sky-coloured stroke on iron, and then it looked right. "And that you were seen first here, before the hall, by a creature that chooses without coaxing." "I would not think to coax," I said. The ribbon's end brushed my knuckles like a breath. "We shall see," she said, not unkindly. "At dawn, you will find that the king's eyes are like a bell on a bird. They ring true when there is truth to ring. It is well you favour steady places." Beyond the shutters the light was thinning. The hawks settled onto their perches with the soft flume of feather on feather. Somewhere a woman laughed, then hushed herself, and footsteps went past as lamplighters moved along the colonnade. The boy clipped the merlin to its block, and set a felt hood gently over the narrow head. The bird stilled, relying on memory and sense, trusting that what it could not see was yet there. Guanois stepped back, as if giving the bird privacy. "You should sleep," she said to me. "Strange beds grow kinder only if you close your eyes." "And you?" I asked, then almost wished I had not. I had crossed the sea to serve a king, not to sharpen my tongue against his daughters. "I live here," she said, with a small smile that lifted one corner of her mouth, and eased something in my chest I had not known was tight. "Even so, I also sleep more sweetly when the birds do." She looked at the ribbon, pleased in a way that did not set me on display. "Good night, Eliduc." She left with the boy and the hoods, her step unhurried. I remained a moment longer, listening to the small sounds of gathered lives, the quiet clack of beak on wood, the muffled shift of straw, the settled hush that comes when creatures accept what the dark asks of them. Then I walked out into the open air. The garden had deepened. Fountains blinked like eyes grown drowsy. In the distance, the sea breathed against its stones, steady as a sleeping animal. I returned to my chamber by the path the steward had named. True to his word, it kept me safe. In the window, a moth pressed its dusty wings to the glass, as if it wished to enter and find the lamp. I loosened the ribbon from my sword and turned it in my fingers. In the dim it held its own pale light, like a sliver of winter sky cupped between my thumbs. On the far side of the wall, a bell sounded twice, one clear note for the lighting of lamps, one low for the closing of gates. Tomorrow, if the morning kept its promise, I would stand before a king and offer the work of my hands. Tonight, I folded the ribbon under my pillow. When I closed my eyes, I saw a Merlin's eye in clean sun, a pool that showed a face without wavering, and a path running on beyond the orange trees, ribboned with light already unspooling. Chapter 4. Rosemary and Rainlight. I had crossed the sea to keep my word, and on the morning the mists finally lifted from this new country, I was called into the great hall. The air there held the faint spice of rosemary crushed beneath a servant's heel, and the fresher scent of rain drying from stone. I moved with the practised ease of duty, feeling the weight of my cloak, the polish of the scabbard against my hip, the steady place where my breath lived when matters were formal and eyes were many. In those first weeks I had given little of myself except my craft, swift decisions on the field, quiet regard at counsel. If I am known for anything, it is for seeing a path and walking it without disquiet, even when the path is narrow. Yet in that hall, as daylight touched coloured glass and made pools of blue and gold on the flags, I felt something stir in me, as unexpected as a warm wind from the sea. She stood near the eastern windows, her gaze turned outward to the court, where the gardeners had arranged herb beds in tidy knots. I learnt later that her name was Eliduc. I learnt before that, in a single moment of looking, that she listened to the world as carefully as I do. The delicate tilt of her head to catch the harp in the corner, the attention she gave a small page trying to still a falcon's restless foot, the way she set aside her own comfort to step forward and help with a strap so it would not chafe the bird's leg. A gentleness, yes, but not softness. There was an exactness to her, a making things right that asked nothing of those she aided except to be as they were. The light found the fine weave of her sleeves and made the threads glow. In her hair, the damp air had left a dark, soft wave. It was not my place to linger on what I saw. The king mounted the dais and bid the court be at ease, and I went before him. He smelled of cedar and old paper, the way ledgers do when the ink has settled into them. He greeted me with a half-smile that did not quite leave his mouth. "You have seen our roads," he said, "and the lines of the streams. Tell me where the bridges asked to be mended." I told him what I had seen on my rides, where the planks were sound but the ropes frayed, where water had undercut the bank, where a village had worked together to pile stones, and had made with patient hands and no brass something that would last. He listened, and the steward took notes, and a murmur rose and fell like a small tide as men marked down tasks to assign. When the king asked after the barracks, I answered. When he asked after the outer walls, I answered. The words were simple, the work unmysterious, yet my mind kept returning to the east windows, to the angles of light on the garden paths. I heard the harp string hush between notes, and found myself, for a heartbeat, uncertain of what I had just said. It was then that she stepped forward, at her father's subtle nod, and came to stand nearer. "Sir," she said, and her voice was clear and low, a brook speaking in shade. "Forgive the question. You have known the sea, I have known it only from the cliffs. When a storm passes at night, how does the dawn begin on the water? Is it sudden, or does it arrive as it does on land, one leaf awake and then another?" The hall seemed to hold its breath, not because a princess had addressed a foreign knight, but because the question found a place inside all of us that saddened or eased. I had been hailed many ways and for many things, for steadiness, for the clean line of a strategy well executed, for blood that cooled quickly after heat. No one had ever asked me about dawn. I thought of it, and words came. "Where I crossed," I said, "the wind slept at last, and the waves remembered how to be kind. The first thing is a path of pale, as if someone drew a blade of light across the water, and then the edges of the swells begin to lift it, curl it, send it farther. The gulls began long before we could see their wings. It is not sudden, it is a learning. The water learns its day." Her mouth curved, not quite a smile, but something that made space for one. "Thank you," she said. "Sometimes my father's men speak of storms as if they were only noise and danger. It is good to know they also teach." The king's half-smile became whole for a breath. "My daughter hoards questions like bees hoard honey," he said, indulgent but oddly proud. "If questions are honey, sire," I replied, because it seemed right to do so. "Answers are the hive. Without one, the other has nowhere to stay." Laughter rose, gentle and brief. The harp found its string again. In the pause that followed, she looked at the emblem set into my baldric. A few lines, simple, the colour rubbed soft by my glove. A sign from another shore, a ring of thought I did not wear on my hand here, but kept close all the same. Her gaze touched it and moved away, as one might brush a leaf and not break it. "You climbed the North Road yesterday," she said, drawing us back to things a court could hear. "Did you see the hermit's cell by the beeches?" "I did. There is rosemary there that grows higher than a man. He says he planted it in a year of sorrow, and now he keeps it because it teaches him how to breathe." There was no self-pity in her tone. She said sorrow, the way one says rain or bread. "The scent is sharp," I said. "It wakes you." "Yes," she answered softly, "and it remains on the hands." She gestured then to one of the servants, who came with a small basket woven of willow. Inside were sprigs of fresh-cut rosemary, beads of water still clinging to the leaves. The king waved her the grace to continue. She took one sprig up, and for the first time I understood how small her hands were. "Take this," she said. "So the halls of our house will come with you when you ride, and the sharpness will keep your thoughts clear when you are tired. My father's men carry time for courage. Rosemary is my stubbornness." She smiled then for real, an admission that stubbornness was less a vice to be hidden than a small tool to be kept near. "In my country," I said, "they say rosemary is for remembrance." The word slipped from me before I could weigh it. I felt as if far away, a shutter open and close. "Then it will do for both," she replied, and placed the sprig in my hand. The leaves were cool against my palm. When I lifted my hand to my face, the scent rose up, bright as winter sunlight across a table. It filled my head and steadied me. It found that place where breath lived and made it wider. After that, the business of the morning resumed. Assignments were given. Men bowed and departed. Voices wove, unknotted, wove again. The scent of rosemary clung and did not fade. I caught her once more by the eastern light, speaking quietly to a woman whose child had been ill. The way she listened was its own kind of balm, more valuable than any spice. I signed my name to a list of oversight for the northern bridges, and promised the steward I would ride before noon. The king thanked me in a tone that held acquaintance now, rather than appraisal. Fingers moved over strings, the falcon settled, soothed by the weight of its hood. When I left the dais, I felt the sprig shift in my glove. I tucked it under the loop of leather at my shoulder, where it made a small green against the dark. Outside, the rain had released the world to light. Puddles mirrored clouds. In them it seemed possible to step into sky. As I crossed the courtyard, a swallow came arrowing low beneath the colonnade, then rose swift as if drawn on a wire by some invisible hand. The rosemary gave up a little more of itself with each step, and the scent braided itself with the memory of the sea's pale path at dawn. My horse turned his head to watch me approach. The groom, a boy with a scatter of freckles like fine sand, ran a hand down the animal's shoulder with care. Far off, bells measured the hour, simple and undecorated. I am not a man who seeks omens in heather or hawks, nor in the way sunlight lands on a particular face. But I would be untrue if I said that. As I set my foot in the stirrup and felt the leather flex and soften, there was not a sense in me of something beginning, a lesson the day would take time to learn, a path of pale drawn across water that would find the edges of everything and lift them one by one. Behind me in the east windows, tapestry figures of hunters and harts ran their stitched course, bound by threads the colour of wine and wheat. One strand, no thicker than a hair, had frayed but not broken. The weaver, whoever she was, had chosen to leave it. In the small wind that moves through halls, even when no door is open, it trembled and held fast and trembled again. Chapter 5. A Name in the Garden. By the time the sea mist lifted, the city that had called for a steady sword lay before me, its roofs shining like wet shells. It was not my home, yet the bells speaking the hour did so in a cadence my heart could understand. I gave my name to the gatekeeper, and was led through stone corridors warmed by the breath of kitchens and the murmur of servants. Salt clung to my cloak like a habit I could not remove. I am Eliduc, once a huntsman of the border forests, oft a guest at tables not my own, trained to read the sky for weather and men's faces for weather of another kind. I have learned how to stand where I am asked to stand, to speak when sought, to keep counsel when needed. The king was at prayer, they told me, and would see me when the bells turned again. While I waited, a young page guided me toward the garden that leaned against the sea like a confidant. We passed under an arch of pale stone, and the world softened. Rosemary and rue threaded the air, figs warmed on the bough, the path's grit whispered beneath my boots. Beyond the low wall, the tide fell back, drawing threads of light across dark sand. A gull, white as scraped bone, hung in the blue and then dropped away, and my thoughts settled as the water settled. There, amid the clipped hedges and small fountains, I first saw her unmistakable, not because of a crown or embroidery, but because a hush seemed to walk before her. She moved with the simple grace of someone who listens even while approaching. A cloak of watered green fell from her shoulders. A small book lay closed in one hand, the other resting lightly on the rail where the garden ended and the sea began. Two attendants lingered at a distance, their voices a soft braid that the breeze unmade. "Sir," she said, as if the word were a greeting and not a measure, and tipped her head so that the light caught on a pin in her hair. "You have the look of someone from away." "Away has many faces," I answered, because I had no wish to pretend. "But yes, these stones are new to me, my lady." There was no rebuke in her eyes, only curiosity gentle as leaf shadow. "They will become familiar if you give them time," she said. "Like a well that only becomes yours after you learn where the rope sticks and how the wind turns the bucket as it rises. I am called Eliduc." She offered the name as one offers water. "Eliduc," I replied, and the simple exchange set a small chord ringing in the quiet of my chest. She rolled the sound once under her tongue. "Eliduc," as if testing a sweet she had never tasted before. For a few breaths we listened to the fountain worry at the basin, and the low shiver of leaves in the salt air. The attendants drew back further, discovering some urgent interest in a knot of lavender. I saw then the mark that distinguished her more than cloth could, a steadiness in the way she regarded what was before her, as though nothing in the world, not even a gull's footfall on the wall, was too small to belong. "Your cloak is crusted with the sea," she said, and there was a smile at the corner of her mouth, not unkind. Were you long upon it, long enough to learn the taste of patience again? I said. The deck pitches you forward and back until your thoughts become grain in the hand. Patience, she repeated, considering the word as much as the salt. We are all asked for it, and not always politely. Did the ocean give back what it took from you? Most of what I lost on it was only sleep, I said, and this made her laugh, soft, like a hand over brass. I did not tell her what else I had left behind or who, because the sea keeps certain confidences, and a garden is not the place to lay bare all the contents of a heart. Do you know our coast? She asked then. When the water pulls away, it leaves small gifts, shells like coins, the odd bit of glass turned into something kind. I used to believe each piece had a story. I suppose I still do. I have found stories in less likely places, I said, thinking of a piece of birch bark in a soldier's kit, a ribbon tied around a letter, the way a hawk's feathers looked when the sun went through them. This will be your sea then. It is a good keeper. It can be, she said, her gaze cutting briefly to the long line where sky and water braided. When the wind is wrong, it can be sharp, but one learns to read it. One learns to stand where the spray won't soak the pages. Only then did I notice the book in her hand was unadorned. Plain leather, his first gold rub worn thin at the corners, as if the pages had travelled with her more than their share. She lifted it slightly, not as display but explanation. I bring it when I wait with the bells, she said. Sometimes words keep time better than iron. Words do not rust, I agreed, and her smile returned, this time unguarded. The scent of rosemary sharpened, and a bee went its purposeful way past us, then reconsidered the hedge and slipped into it with workman's humility. There was an ease between us then that did not feel borrowed. We spoke of small things because small things are often the honest ones, the best place to sit when the afternoon threatens rain. Way the light shifted in the cloister when winter came. A swallow that had nested above a lintel and returned to the same thin ledge each year. When she asked, I told her a little about a forest from which I came, not naming it, only describing how the wind there moved in tiers, and how after snow every sound was a bell covered by wool. In return, she told me how, when she was a child, she believed she could hear the whales breathing on heavy nights. The house would settle, she said, her voice just above the fountain's murmur, and the lanterns would sway if anyone walked past. I would listen and be certain the ocean itself was lying beside the wall, drawing one breath and then another, slow and kind. It was a comfort I allowed myself. It is good to allow such comforts, I said, and in the space of that sentence, understood that I had allowed myself few. A bell spoke from within the palace then, a round note, and her eyes flicked toward the sound. Duty and habit intertwined in that glance like two vines taught to share a trellis. She did not seem burdened by it, only mindful. You were to see my father when the bells turned, she said. He is gracious to those who listen more than they speak. I will do my best to please him, I said, and if something in me wanted to remain in the sun-dappled square of garden forever instead, well, there are wishful winds that pass through any man when spring presses against a wall. Gileadon reached toward the rosemary hedge, careful not to startle the bee that had made it home. Her fingers moved through the green with careful knowledge, and when she brought her hand back, a sprig lay between her fingers, its leaves cool and dark, its scent clean, almost resinous. For patience, she said, placing it in my palm. For whatever the sea did not give back, it was no vow, no token meant to bind, only a simple herb carried from winter into every kitchen, pricked by every cook for stews and broths. Yet when it touched my hand, it felt like a promise written in a language I could learn. I tucked it beneath the edge of my glove so the sap would not stain my cuff. The small, ordinary weight of it steadied me more than any plate of iron ever had. We walked together toward the arch, her attendants falling in with the ease of practised water. The corridor beyond was cooler, stone breathing out its stored shade. Somewhere near, a door closed. Somewhere far, a wave unrolled. At the threshold she paused and turned, as if something half-remembered had brushed her shoulder. "You will come again to the garden," she said, not asking. "If I am permitted," I replied. And then, because I could not help it, "If the bells and the tide agree, they have more in common than most believe," she said, smiling that quiet smile again. "They both take their time." I bowed, habit and sincerity folded together, and she went the other way, the green of her cloak, like a soft leaf vanishing among stone. As I made my way toward the hall, where my name had been carried ahead of me, the sprig of rosemary pressed a cool line against my wrist. In the high window, a pale moth tapped at the light, patient as a prayer. Beyond the wall, the sea pulled and returned, gathering itself for what came next. Chapter 6. Across the Quiet Water. I had learned that choices announce themselves not in trumpets, but in the way the morning air holds its breath. On the day the sea became our road, the harbour lay pale under a mild sky, and even the gulls seemed to speak softly. My name is Eliduc, a knight who once believed vows were fences, not paths. Beside me walked Eliduc, whose courage wears a cloak of quietness, and whose gaze meets the world as if it has stories to tell her, and not the other way around. I felt the weight of another name, Gildeluc, my wife. Hers is the steadiness of a hearth when winter gnaws the door. Between those two flames I carried a heart that feared neither steel nor truth, and yet trembled at the thought of failing either. We had come to the quay at first light, Gilliadern hooded in a traveller's mantle, me with a purse of coin and a question no wind could answer. The harbour was a gentle confusion of rope and voice. Tar sweetened the salt in the air, wet wood breathed, men lifted barrels with grunts that were more like prayers than labour. A small ship lay waiting, no more than a single mast and a bronze bell the size of a child's helmet. The captain was a lean man whose eyes weighed tides without needing to look at them. He watched our approach and inclined his head with a respect that hid curiosity. I had arranged this passage quietly. To leave without ceremony felt like entering a chapel by the side door, letting the candles judge me in their own time. Gilliadun kept her hand within the sleeve of her cloak, as if warming her fingers in a thought. "Is your sea different from mine?" she asked, looking past me at the bright rim of the horizon. "Only in how it knows my name," I said, smiling because that answer felt less heavy than any honest one. "At home the wind smells of rosemary when it comes off the fields. The gulls complain less when the tide turns, and the shore stones are flatter, they skip farther when thrown." She laughed, the sound like a coin tapped on a table to prove its ring. "Then I will learn to skip stones with you," she said. "I have practiced little else but listening and waiting. Listening and waiting." She said them as if they were crafts perfected by patience. There was courage hidden in them, and trust. Her life had been not just a tapestry of courtly hours, but also a schooling in restraint. I touched the edge of her sleeve, a gesture so brief it could be mistaken for accident by any curious eye. "We cross quickly," I said, because it comforted me to speak the future as if plan and fate were the same thing. The captain shook out his sail like a priest lifting linen. A breeze pressed its hand against it, crisp and obliging. The lines hummed. The bell gave a round, honest sound as the hull loosened from the dock's embrace. The ship shifted its weight, and the harbour ceded us to the broader blue without fuss. We moved out past the breakwater stones. The water there was the colour of a raven's feather, tipped with sunlight, a blue so dark it might almost forgive. I felt the give of the deck under my boots, the subtle life in it, like a living thing carrying us with the care of an ox that knows the worth of what it draws. Gilliadun stood easy at the rail, her grip light, her balance sure in a way I had not expected. Even the sea seemed gentled by her nearness. The spray came up and did not sting. We did not speak of what lay behind us. There is a dignity in leaving quietly, as one closes a door without seeking to hear whether anyone notices. I held the rail and watched the folds of water opening like pages we were meant to read greedily and could only read slowly. In the mind's small theatre, Gildeluc's face rose not as reproach, but as a steady flame, a fixed star. I did not have the words yet to give to either woman the respect of my full truth. I told myself I would find them on the other shore, where my tongue had first learned to speak the vowels that now tugged in different directions. It is a humble hope, to trust that honest words wait at the ends of journeys the way letters wait at home. A pair of porpoises came to pace us, brown backs curving with a rhythm that made dancers of us all. When they broke the surface, the air filled with that faint, clean breath that belongs only to creatures who sleep in water and dream of the sun. Eliduc leaned forward, and I saw the child she had been once, knees muddied by gardens, laughing at beetles. "They look like punctuation," she said, as if the sea writes with commas. Her frivolity was a balm. "What will you write when we land?" I asked, because play makes truth easier, and I wanted her thoughts in the open, where I could share their warmth. She did not answer at first. The wind played with the loose hair at her temple, and one bright strand caught in the roughness of the rope near her hand, clinging like a question not yet formulated. "I will write whatever your land teaches me to write," she said at last, "and I hope its first lesson is kindness." Kindness. The word lay like a stone stacked on a cairn, small but weighty in its way. I nodded, not pointing out that lands have many tongues, but often only one character. Instead, I told her of the river we would follow inland, wide as a meadow, and of the abbey whose bells could be heard on still mornings all the way to the apple dells. I told her how my home smells when the peat is cut, and what the light does to the beech leaves in the late afternoon, making each one a thin coin of green fire. I spoke not to persuade, but to share, and to feel that the place toward which we were moving had room for two words placed side by side, past and new. Midday came and went with no more ceremony than a cloud casting a soft shadow and removing it again. The captain ate his bread and cheese, sitting on a coil of rope, and nodded to me as if to say that the sea had decided to be merciful. Eliduc accepted a cup of watered wine and crushed a sprig of something between her fingers. A bit of fennel, perhaps, bringing it to her nose. Her appreciation for small things humbled me. I had trained myself to read banners on far hillsides, to listen for the change in a horse's breath that means it will not run much longer. She could find music in the straw pattern on a basket, or a story in the way a bee chooses one flower over another. It is one kind of bravery to face steel, another to attend to the soft details when a life might be about to change shape entirely. As the afternoon began to lean itself toward evening, the water shifted to the colour of slate rubbed with chalk. The wind lost interest, then remembered us, then forgot again. Progress slowed, but it did not stop. The bell at the mast kept its counsel. I felt, with the knowing that lives below thought, that we had entered that portion of a journey where time no longer counts in hours, but in breaths. On the horizon, a line nudged upward where the sky met the sea. At first it could have been a cloud shadow, then it became certainty, the low, patient back of land. Eliduc saw it when I saw it, and her hand tightened on my sleeve, the way a bird might settle its weight, a fraction heavier on a branch. "Is that your home?" she asked, though she already knew. "My home is inland," I said, "but yes, that is the shore from which I learned to name mornings." The words carried a small ache, the ache of a child when he first understands that a particular tree is not every tree, a particular hand not every hand. To name a morning is to claim it, and with claiming comes the knowledge of loss. I reached into my mantle where the small things of travel live, and felt the smoothness of the token I had carried, since I was scarcely more than a boy, a piece of beech carved into the shape of a leaf, rubbed by time until it held the polish of all my decisions. I thought of pressing it into Eliduc's palm, as if tokens could stand in for promises. I did not. Some gifts belong to the spaces between, not to the hands that wait. We angled toward the darker water that marks a river's mouth. Reeds made their remarks at the edge of sight. A lone fishing boat bobbed near the channel, and an old woman in it raised her oar in greeting. Her face was a seam of wrinkles, her smile a stitch that held it all together. Gilliadun waved back with that open delight that endears strangers to her without their knowing why. "Do you think," she asked, her voice low, "that rivers ever ask the sea for permission before they enter?" "No," I said, "I think they only bow. Permission is an invention. Gratitude is older." She considered that and nodded. The light gathered itself along the riverbanks, gilding cattails and the narrow tongues of willow leaves. Somewhere a bell carried delicately on the air, like a thought you catch by accident, its notes counting not hours but arrivals. In the rigging above us, a single red thread shivered where it had worked loose from the hem of Gilliadun's cloak, defiant against the grey of sail and sky. I reached up carefully, mindful of not tugging, and tucked it back into the weave. The thread was warm from the day's light. For a moment it lay across my knuckles, like a line drawn on a map. I let it go, and it vanished where it belonged. Yet I knew it by touch now. Some things once felt cannot be unfelt. Some patterns once glimpsed call to the fingers. Land wore its evening colours, green shaded toward blue, stone toward soft black. The ship leaned into the river's freshened pull, and I felt the world alter around us. A threshold passed not with fanfare, but with the quiet rearrangement of scents and sounds. Rosemary hiding in hedges, peat and rain arguing gently in the air, the first inclination of night. We would anchor soon and move by smaller craft under branches that knew my footsteps. I would lead Gilliadun past the watermill where the wheel sings, along the path where hair-rails lean, to the place where truth waits like a door expected for years, but never yet knocked upon. I did not know the words I would use, only that they would be mine, and that the river had already begun saying them for me in its patient voice. The bell at the mast gave one soft note, as if confirming a decision. Above us, a formation of birds turned, black script against a pearl sky, writing lines we could not read and yet understood. Ahead, the lights of a village blinked awake, kind and small, while behind us the sea sighed, gathering its stories back. We slipped forward, and evening slipped down. Somewhere between reed and star, promise and proof, I felt the subtle shifting that means a life is about to take on a new shape. Only the water knew it fully, only the wind could be trusted to carry the news. And in the last of the light, the river opened like a page newly turned, its margins wide and inviting, the next words not yet written but close enough to touch. Chapter 7. At the edge of morning, I had been living between two vows, the oath that drew me far from home, and the quieter promise that had once steadied my life. Between them, a gentler pledge had come to flower, where I had not thought to plant anything at all. In the pale cold of a winter afternoon, I walked the stone colonnade that ringed the foreign court, my steps sounding in the vault like small bells. The air smelled of damp leaves and cooling wax, torches hissed softly, and beyond the arches the garden held its breath under frost. I am Eliduc, soldier by habit, guest by necessity, and the weight of departure had already settled into my shoulders, not like armour, but like a cloak I had promised to wear. Her footfall arrived before her voice, and then she was there, Gilliadun, light in step even in fur-lined slippers, a ribbon of sky caught in her gaze. I have known many kinds of courage. Hers was quiet and exacting, a tenderness that did not tremble. "You walk as if counting," she said, coming to my side. Her hand, ungloved, brushed the cold rail. A small vein pulsed blue at the wrist. "What measures you?" "Breath," I answered, because truth came easier in the hush of this place. "And the edges of things. There is a line before me, and beyond it home." The word hung without explanation. She did not ask for one. Frost had embroidered every shrub with crystalline lace, and when we turned the corner, the little chapel's door stood open to a candle's pale flame. From within came a single voice threading a prayer. From without, the winter birds kept to whispered music. We paused. I had meant to find an hour's quiet in which to translate impulse into decision. The hour found me anyhow. "You will go," Gilliadun said, her words neither accusation nor plea. She carried certainty the way others wore ornaments, unafraid of its weight. "I must," I said, and in the must there were not only letters and seals, but older forms, promises made in other rooms, with other hands. If I do not return, my name will be spoken like a broken line. I cannot leave my past unstitched. She turned her face toward the cloistered garden, where rosemary kept green against the season. And if you do return, she asked softly, what becomes of the present? I lay my palm along the frosted rail, and waited for cold to steady me. There are questions that arrive like wind through a door you had not realized was ajar. In her eyes I saw the court as it had been to me when I first arrived. A refuge where work was clean and honour plain, a place where I had not expected to be seen beyond steel. She had altered its light. I do not know, I told her, except that I will not run from truth, nor carry you into harm. You deserve a life that is whole, not stolen from corridors. She smiled, not triumphantly, but with a small sad gladness, as if I had passed a test she had written without ink. Then we must make it whole by walking it in daylight. If you go, let me go with you. The breath left me as if I had been struck, but gently, a feathered blow. The chapel candle flickered. A draught had found it. Gileadun, I said, and her name in my voice was both prayer and warning. The sea is not mild in winter, nor are men. The world is full of long looks. My land is not your land. My past is not your path. My path is where my heart can speak plainly, she said. What is the shape of a life if one must whisper? I am not made for hiding under veils, Eliduc. I will not be left to a song the court invents about me. I would rather ride into cold and risk the truth. She did not grasp my hand. She did not need to. In that moment I saw the fields of my childhood spooling out to the line of the forest. The small church with its single cracked bell. The window where a different faithful gaze once waited. The image did not fall away. It stood beside Gileadun's face, not as competition, but as a hard blue stone against river water. I could not pretend the stone was less real, or that the river did not move around it. The crossing is long. I tried again, gently. My ship is small. We will be seen. Then let us be seen, she replied. By the sea, by your God, by mine. Let us be seen by the sun, and by whatever finds us at the shore. I will bring only what I can carry. I will not fumble you. I will not turn on the path. You learn a person in such conversations as no campaign can teach you. She would not be flung by rumours, by cold, by the deep. She would gather those things, wrap them in herself, and keep walking. My own courage felt pedestrian beside hers, useful for battle and for oaths, but less tested by the exposed face of a choice. I bowed my head, because in that position I could speak least proudly. Come then, I said. Come, and may God find us honest. A ripple of something, relief, fear, the piercing sweetness of decisiveness ran through me. The chapel candle steadied. The light outside shifted, as if the hour had moved deliberately on a single gear. You cannot stop certain wheels. They ask only if you wish your hands upon them. We did not call a throng of servants. We did not announce anything to the echoes. She returned to her chamber and pulled from a carved coffer the simplest of gowns, a travelling cloak the colour of moss, a small leather satchel that already smelled of soap and lemon. I took from my own quarters a cloak newly lined, a knife because you take one everywhere, and a pouch of coins sufficient to turn doors into thresholds. We met in the stable court where the horses blew steam into the copper air, and the grooms moved noiselessly, accustomed to midnight and dawn. Only two, I told my men. I had long ago learned the value of trusting a few who would not think for me, but with me. They nodded once, their faces wearing the neutral kindness of those who love without question. The sky let down a star or two from a torn cloud. Somewhere deep in the palace, a lute, oblivious to all our new velocity, traced a melody meant for after-supper. Gileadun paused at the chapel door on her way out, and bowed to the altar. Her candle she left burning before a small carved saint, whose worn feet had known many lips. When she joined me, she carried no jewel, no crest, only a strip of red silk at her throat that caught the light of a passing torch. I might have asked for letters, for papers. Instead, I asked for the honesty we had already chosen. We rode by lanes that twisted like ivy, keeping to hedges and sleeping orchards. The night had the clean taste of iron. As hooves touched old stone, little sparks occurred and died like thoughts. Eliduc's seat was light. Her body moved with the horse, the way a swimmer lets water go through fingers. She did not speak unless necessary. When one of the gates refused its rust for us, her smile to the sleepy keeper, merely that did what no coin could have done more quietly. We reached the coast while the horizon still kept its ink. The harbour was no grand device, only a handful of hulls swaying like hounds at their leads, ropes creaking, a lantern bobbing, a man humming something without words. The smell of tar was strong, mingled with salt and wet rope, and the faint ghost of fish put up long before. I liked the place for its honesty. It did not pretend to be anything but what it was, and no more. My small ship waited with a patience I recognized. She had brought me here. She would carry me back. Her single mast stood black against a thought of light. As we approached, a gull cried once, and made a pale stroke across the dark, as if to write a line and stop. I felt the ground ease into the tide's long pulse, and took comfort in the steadiness of that rhythm, older than us, older than our names, cold. I asked her, feeling the question arrive as a sacrament she was owed. "Only as much as makes me wakeful," she said, pulling her cloak closer. Her cheeks were bright with air. The strip of silk at her throat stirred. "I will sleep later, when we are farther out." We stepped across plank to deck, and the boards rocked under us with a familiarity that loosened something tight around my lungs. My men saw to the lines. The harbour's lantern blinked its slow lid, part signal, part star. I looked back only once, and what I saw there was neither condemnation nor relief, but a shape whose edges the dawn had begun to soften. The court would wake and notice. Stories would begin their silent seeds. That was for the day. For now there was only the stair-step of breath and the sound of rope passing through a pulley. I set my hand on the rail, where salt had roughened the wood. Next to me, Eliduc mirrored my gesture, her fingers leaving 4 faint crescents of warmth in the cold grain. The sail climbed and bellied and caught. The ship, sensing the change the way an animal senses its rider's mood, leaned into water, and the shore rolled slowly, as if it had decided to rest. Across the flats the first light showed itself, not trumpeting but spilling, gentle and certain. It burnished the surface into pewter and then into a suggestion of silver. Far out, the seam between sea and sky held tight, impossible to tell where one ended, where one began. I felt in that joining the modesty of what we had done, and the enormity too. "Listen," Eliduc said, and we heard it together, the low, unceasing murmur that is not wind and not wave, but the conversation between them. It sounded like advice not yet formed into words. We turned our faces toward that wide speaking, and let it carry us out. Somewhere behind, a bell lifted a small, clear note, and let it travel. Somewhere ahead, a swallow stunned by winter darted, reconsidered, and vanished. Between these 2 markers, we made our passage. The air smelled faintly of rosemary still. I realized she had tucked a sprig into her satchel. I did not think of omens. I thought of the simple balance of the deck, of the way our shadows leaned together as the sun began its work, of the currents that run under what is visible and yet decide so much. The wind shifted a hair's breadth and grew curious. I drew my cloak close and looked to the horizon, where a darker line whispered of weather. It did not frighten me. It looked rather like a question laid upon the water, and I have always preferred a question to a silence. Chapter 8. The Red Flower. I came to the little hermitage before the sun found the mossy lintel, carrying a basket of bread and a heart I had not yet named. My name is Eliduc, wife to Eliduc, and I had asked leave to keep vigil beside the young lady who slept as if the world had stepped softly around her. The place smelled of beeswax and linen. The hermit had made a bed from a chest and a folded cloak, and the girl lay there with her hair unbound over the pillow, a spill of pale gold against grey wool. I learnt her name only yesterday, Eliduc, and it floated through me like one of those little larks that sing unseen above the furrows, as if it belonged to open fields and a sky too high for my touch. She was light to look upon, even in ill fortune. Her mouth still held the faintest curve of someone who has smiled at seas and stories. I set the basket down and touched her hand through the linen sheet. It was cool, not the unreachable cold of stone, but the coolness of a winter apple kept well. When I leaned close, I could find no breath at her lips, yet I could not say she was gone. There was a lingering in her, some reluctance to lose the lamps and voices of this life. I had thought before my feet brought me here that I would feel sharpness. Woman to woman, I expected to bristle. Instead, there was a stillness in me that could hold another's sorrow for a time. I folded a cloth, damped it in a bowl, and bathed her temples, not in ceremony, but the way a mother tends a child after fever. Above us, the beams were rough-hewn and flecked with old candle smoke. A sparrow had made a nest where the roof and wall met, and its faint rustle gave the room a sense of being yet lived in. I spoke little, only her name and a few harmless prayers. Eliduc, I said once, because names are a kind of key. My dear, the day is gentle. If you would stay, it will take you kindly. The window, only 2 stones knocked out long ago, sent a square of pale light across the floor. Dust turned in it, a slow dance of motes. I watched them to steady my thoughts. I am a patient woman by habit, and patience kept me safer now than any pride. When the morning grew, the frost outside gave way to a damp gleam. I opened the door for a breath of air, and the smell of crushed fern came in, dark and green. The hedgerow along the path was threaded with briars, and something small and quick moved there with the slightest rustle, as if the ferns themselves had decided to change places. I stood under the lintel, letting the chill come to my face, and listened to a blackbird piping in the alder. I thought of Eliduc only by the steady pressure of his name against my ribs, a presence I did not untie. The choices waiting were like roads wet with rain, muddy, shining, branching. Movement flickered at the corner of the step, a small creature slipping under the door as if it knew the house of prayer as well as the hedges. A weasel as slender as a glove. It paused, nose working, bright eyes taking the measure of me and of the room where the girl lay. I had never had cause to look closely at such a creature. It was quick and silent, arrogant in its own small survival. The hermit's staff leaned by the door. Whether I reached for it, or whether my elbow nudged it as I set the latch, I cannot say. It slid, clattered down across the stones, and the weasel, startled, leapt and twisted, and did not leap again. Its little body lay just so, as if sleep had seized it mid-air. There was no blood, only the sudden stillness of it, and my heart faltered with an ache of regret at the clumsiness. I knelt and touched it with 2 fingers. The fur was finer than I had guessed, and warm. Before I could make sense of that small accident, a second weasel appeared in the hedge, a flash of brown silk, and then vanished. I thought it gone, but in the length of one drawn breath it came again, a tiny blaze of purpose, darting to the threshold with something vivid and delicate clenched in its teeth. It had a flower, red as a fresh ember, star-shaped, with petals as thin as a child's fingernails. The scent of it was surprising, a spice that reminded me of summer kitchens and the tartness of quince. The little animal did not falter. It set the flower against the muzzle of its still companion, nosing it skillfully, wanting, it seemed, to share some secret of the fields. I crouched there, forgotten by them, and watched. The red touched the pale whiskers. I could not move for fear of breaking the spell. And as I watched, the small chest stirred and rose, a thread of breath returned, the soft body flexed. The weasel's eye opened, black and bright. In the doorway I made a sound despite myself, a swallowed exclamation, and both creatures turned their heads. For the span of a heartbeat we regarded one another. 3 beings under one arch, with the same simple astonishment. Then they were gone as suddenly as rain, slipping into their narrow world with one shadow of motion. I held the flower. It was still warm, or that is what I tell myself when I think of it now. The red of it was not the harsh red of a wound, but the red one sees in certain sunsets, when the sun slides into cloud and rooms are briefly lit as if with wine. I brought it into the little house and shut the door with care, as if the air could spill and I must keep it in. Eliduc lay where she had lain, her lashes like faint lines on her cheek. I went to her, I who had watched her with a steady pulse for an hour, and felt no envy, only the weight of naming and being named. I did not ask permission of any saint or book. The wisdom of the weasel is older than any prayer I know. I lifted the flower to the girl's mouth. The scent loosened something behind my eyes and in my chest. I touched the red to her lips, which were cool and pale as the inside of a shell. Perhaps it was wishfulness that made me hold my breath this time. Perhaps it was the care we give when we fear to break an egg. The room was quiet, but for the little stir of sparrows and the far-off drip of thawing eaves. I laid the petals over her mouth, and then at the tender hollow of her throat, where the skin is thin enough for light. And in the silence a change began, so softly I thought I had imagined it. A sigh, the first sweet surrender of air. It did not come all at once. It rose the way mist rises off a field when the sun reaches it. First a suggestion, then the proof of it, then the world altered by it. Her chest lifted and fell. Colour threaded under her skin, like dawn rising under snow. Her eyelids quivered, as if a small bird had fluttered within them, and then stilled, and then opened. She was in the room with me. Her gaze was not yet steady. She looked past me and through me, as those new to wakefulness do, gathering the furniture of the moment back into place. Then she found my face. The pupils widened and settled. There was confusion, then the smallest recognition, not of me, but of the human closeness of a face, the kindness in a pair of hands that had not harmed her. She tried to speak and failed, shaping the beginning of a syllable that could have been any one of our names. I held the flower in my open palm as if it too had come alive. "I am here," I said, because it was true, and because it was all I could promise. "You are safe." Looking at her, I felt the world tilt and right itself. Not by law or by fairness, those are snares by another name, but by some older balance that made room. Outside, a bell in a far farmyard shook the air once, softly, like a drop falling from a leaf. I covered her again, drawing the linen up and tucking it at her shoulder. There would be questions soon, and steps to take across thresholds that would not be easy. For now I gave her water, tipping a spoon to her lips, and she swallowed as if remembering how. Her hair smelled faintly of the sea, or else I imagined the salt, because some part of her had crossed a long way to return. On the far edge of the window's square of light, a beetle traced a patient circle. The flower lay between us like a small hearth. I thought of the ferret-bright eyes at the door, and their blunt wisdom, how one creature's care had called another back. I did not look toward the road, but I felt it winding from the hermitage, through the trees toward the place where choices wait. This morning had made a new bend in it. I smoothed the linen once more, and Gileadun's fingers, warmer now, twitched as if they reached for a hand they knew. Beyond the hedge the blackbird sang a phrase and then repeated it, and the light on the floor edged forward a quiet tide. Somewhere, I knew, my husband's boots would find the path, whether by chance or by the tug of whatever thread had drawn all of us here. I let the thought rest, not tugging it. The red flower, drying in the shallow dish I had set it in, kept its colour. It seemed to me, as the morning leaned into day, that it held the shape of what must unfold. A star, a compass, a small bright thing that points without speaking. Chapter 9. A Leaf of Waking. I kept her where the forest grew attentive, in a small chapel that smelled of resin and rain. The doors stood open to the path, and the world seemed to lower its voice when it crossed the threshold. My name is Eliduc, once a man of oaths and iron, now a quiet watcher of breath. I had brought Eliduc here when the sea stole the colour from her lips, and I had not found the courage to bring her anywhere else. She lay on a narrow bed beneath a window of uncoloured glass, her hair unbound like a spill of light over the linen, her hands at peace atop a blanket I had mended myself with clumsy thread. The hermit who kept this place was away on a circuit of villages, leaving the bell rope swaying and the bees to patrol the sill, and each morning I bathed her face with water I had warmed in a clay bowl, telling myself I was merely tending a flame that would not be extinguished if I stayed. This morning the path had another set of steps. I knew them at once by their sure measure, by how they never scuffed stone. Eliduc's footfall had carried me across 10 years, through youth and feast, through weathering. She paused in the doorway, her cloak powdered with pine dust, her face more open to the air than I deserved. We had spoken little since my return from across the sea, and not at all about the long sleep in this hidden place. Yet here she was, looking from me to the bed and then back again, her gaze clear as river water. I could not keep a promise inside silence any longer. I said, the confession slipping out before I had the art to prepare it. If I am to be truthful at last, it must begin here. She did not rebuke me. There was a steadiness in my wife that I had always mistaken for stillness. I realized watching her cross the room that what I had called stillness was in fact a kind of listening. She came to Eliduc's side and placed her palm above the blanket without touching, as one tests the nearness of a flame. She is very young to be so quiet, Eliduc murmured. And you are very changed to be so gentle, I exhaled. The chapel held us in its wood-smelling hush. Outside, a thrush stitched an invisible seam through air, note to note. Dust motes turned their small orbits in the good light. There are moments when the world, fatigued by human secrets, gives its own answer. From the shadow near the altar, a small creature, brown as leaf loam, quick as spilled water, flickered across the floor. I thought it a blur of mouse until it lifted a sleek head and glanced at us with bright thinking eyes. A weasel, I realized, though I had rarely seen one so close, its body like a braid of muscle and silk. It darted to the threshold, another following, lighter, curious. The first paused, and in that instant a fallen candlestick, precariously leaned, slid from its edge and struck a soft, astonishing blow. The smaller creature lay still, a little twist of fur upon the flagstones. Eliduc inhaled, a thin, aching sound. I reached for the candlestick, but she stayed my hand, touch warm, brief. We watched, breathing shallowly, as the living weasel vanished, and then returned, bearing something in its mouth, an herb with blade-shaped leaves, glossy and wet with dew, although their stems were dry. It laid the sprig across its companion's muzzle, nosed it, pushed it with insistence. The scent rose, sharp, clean, like crushed birch and rain on cold stone. I could taste it as if it were a word before speaking. The still one trembled, as if startled by a thought, then drew breath, first ragged, then whole. They touched noses and slipped into the ferns. So simple, so unschooled, such mercy. We were left with the smell of the herb in the chapel and the quiet that follows a prayer. Eliduc bent to the leaves, picked them up with a careful, almost reverent hand. "Let us not pretend we have not been shown a thing," she said, not looking at me, her voice steadier than my knees. I stood frozen a moment, on the thin plank between hope and fear. Hope, because here was a sign delivered in a language any heart could read. Fear, because to invite breath was to invite the future, and I had made a tangle of futures. I moved to her side. Together we crushed the leaves between cloth, until they gave their green, and their scent filled the bowl and our fingers. My hands shook. Eliduc's did not. She dipped the edge of the cloth, and wrung a drop onto Eliduc's lower lip, a green bead like a bead of mourning. We waited. It slid, and for the first time in many weeks I saw the faintest stir of swallow. "Again," I whispered. We worked with the patience of winter light. Drop by drop, breath by breath, the herb made a cool path across that still mouth, along the edges of a silence I had come to know too well. The chapel's small noises, the rope's soft tap, the flutter of bees, the wing sound of the thrush turning, grew enormously dear, as if every small life in the clearing held itself back to watch. It came like dawn comes in a room with no shutters, not sudden, but irreversibly, The first sign was not a movement but a return. Colour found its way back to Eliduc's lips, faint as a blush across snow, then gathered resolve. Her eyelashes moved. A stilled breath became a shiver, then a sigh that I felt in my own chest. She opened her eyes slowly, as if the world were too bright to meet at once, and in them was the green of places I had sailed past and never entered, the depth of waters that had not drowned me. She looked first at the window, light, leaves, then at Gildeluc, then at me. The gaze found me like a name being remembered. For a heartbeat, I was a young man again, standing on a foreign shore, asking for a word in a language I had not learned. "You are safe," I said, though the word safe seems a frail boat for such a passage. "Am I dreaming?" she asked, her voice dry as paper, and the weight in it undid me. Gildeluc brought the warmed water, tipped it carefully, touched her brow with the damp cloth that still carried the herb's clean scent. "Not now," she said, and smiled, not unkindly, though there is much to wake to. Gildeluc turned her face slightly, so that the window light slid along her cheek. Her hand lifted a little from the blanket, testing the air between us, as if learning its temperature. I took that hand only when she allowed it, and it was warm, and the world, which had seemed spent and hushed and narrow, widened in the space of that contact. I would like to say I fell to my knees in gratitude, that I spoke the right words in the right order, that I knew how to hold both their gazes at once without failing either one. But I only stood there with the cloth darkening in my fist, hearing my own breath measure the present. Gildeluc set the bowl aside and looked from Gilliadun to me as one reading the lines of two maps that share a country. "I have followed you across rooms where your voice was not," she said softly, "and there was no storm in it, only weather old and true. Now we must decide which of us will live where." It was not an accusation. It was the most honest description of the world I had made. The chapel seemed to feel it too. The thrush went quiet. In the pause that followed, a bell far off in the village hinted the hour, one round note that trembled on. Gilliadun's eyes closed and opened again, and in them there was wonder, and then question, not yet sharpened into fear. "I remember water," she whispered, "and your hand at mine. After that, only sleep." "Sleep is over," Gilliadu said. She smoothed the blanket, fingers moving with the tenderness of women who have tended things through all manner of seasons. "Rest if you can. Your strength will return by small steps." I fetched a cup and the honey we kept in a stoppered jar near the altar. The spoon tinked against the clay, an ordinary sound that felt made of rescue. Gilliadun sipped. Her throat moved, light catching at its hollow. In the corner, where the weasels had vanished, a fern frond lifted in a draught, only it felt, and made its own agreement. I did not know how to thank fate for its thrift, giving a sign with a leaf and letting a life come back by scent, and drop and patience. I did not know how to be the man who had waited, and the man who would act. The chapel did not press me. It allowed the hour to be only what it was. We sat a while, the three of us, and for the first time our silence was not a wall, but a clearing where something might be built. Through the open doors, the path shone pale under the canopy. Two directions from the threshold, each with its particular light, a narrow way that kept close to the stream, another that climbed toward the ridge where the bell lived. Gilliadun's fingers tightened once around mine, and then loosened in a brief, trusting sleep. Gilliadun drew her cloak more closely about her, and watched the dust turn slow in the beam. I felt the day lean, not unkindly, toward the choice that would have to be named. Outside, the thrush began again, a thread of sound drawn toward some distance I could not yet see. We listened as its song stitched the morning together, and when it paused, all three of us lifted our heads to the open door, as if hearing in the path the shape of what must come. Chapter 10. Where the Bell Will Ring. I came to the wood at first light, and breathed the salt sweet air that drifted inland from the grey sea. My name is Eliduc. Once a knight and a wanderer, now a man learning how to listen to the quiet that lives beneath every leaf. The small chapel waited as if it had always stood here, though yesterday it was a scaffold and a promise. Its stones were still pale with new lime. A single beam of oak ran like a firm spine along the roof. When I laid my palm to it, the grain felt warmer than the morning. In the hush, I could hear everything. The softened talk of two men finishing a last seam of mortar, a gull's cry turned hollow by distance, the faint give of rope against a bell that had not yet sung. Eliduc stood near the lintel, her shawl folded over her arms, her face shining in the mild light, as if it came less from the sky than from some quiet within her. She had already walked the measure of this decision with me, step for step, with the steadiness of a hand that keeps a lantern from swinging in wind. Eliduc stood a pace behind, the hem of her dress catching bits of straw, her gaze moving over the low altar, the narrow windows, the square of cleared earth like a field freshly sown. There was softness in her mouth, an expression like the edges of sleep. When she looked at me, it was not with the bright impatience of first love, nor the ache of loss. It was the deep, calm tide between shores, after a long storm has settled. We did not speak much. There had been enough words in other seasons, names spoken and held, names entrusted back to silence. Now the chapel smelled of beeswax, and cut wood, and damp stone, the scents that make a place. A small basket of candles rested on the step. I rubbed a thumb along one, and felt the smoothness take my skin. Brother Alan, who had lent his thin hands and knowledge of mortar to our effort, touched the curve of the doorway and stepped aside as if to say that the walls now belonged more to the wind than to him. He had the face of a man who hears prayers in the shuffle of leaves. He nodded to me, his grey eyebrows lifting with something like a benediction, and went to coil a spare length of the bell rope, humming a little, tuneless and content. I walked around the chapel once, slow as if I might startle it, and paused at the corner where the bracken thinned, and the old beech leaned in. Under its roots the earth rose gently, mossy and secretive. It was there beneath the green swoop that we had once laid a body we thought beyond recall, and there that a small, fierce life, a weasel no larger than an alder branch, had taught me what a single flower could insist upon. We had watched the leaves part, watched the creature bring a sprig of red, living flame and press it to the still mouth, and watched breath return as if it had never known how to leave. The memory lived in my body like a warm coin, something I could touch without anyone seeing. That morning the air smelled of that day, though here and there the bramble was hinged with dry seed pods instead of blossoms. If I listened hard enough, I could hear the story of the wood telling itself how sap thickened and roots tightened against frost, how foxes wrote their names in soft paths under the ferns without knowing they wrote at all. The chapel was another sentence in that story. If I did it right, our words would be simple and patient. Eliduc came to stand beside me, her shawl brushing my sleeve, a small sound like a folded sigh in her throat. "The light suits this place," she said. It did. It fell through the east slit window like a thin hand, and made a pale bar on the floor, where dust drifted in a slow dance. Eliduc stepped into that bar of light, and smiled as if she felt it weigh, fine as silk, across her brow. I saw, in that motion, the courage she wore, even when the world remade her life without asking. I had not slept much, but I was not tired. There is a different kind of wakefulness that comes when you put down burden after burden, and the last one still sits in your hands. I had brought the sword that had earned me both the respect of men and the trouble of my own mind. Its hilt had worn to the shape of my palm, a deep, comfortable hollow. The blade was still bright where I kept it oiled for years out of habit, but along the fuller, a constellation of unseen nicks lived, small histories of iron meeting iron. No horns sounded to mark what we were about to do, no herald watched, no court waited. It seemed right that there were only the three of us, and Brother Alan, and the gulls, and the dull hum of the sea. Inside the chapel, the walls kept the breeze but not its smell. The altar was low and unadorned, a block of stone still cool from the night's breath. I ran my fingers along its edge, and felt the grit of earth clinging where mud had touched the base. We lit only one candle. Its flame made the plaster glow with a patient winter light. A man can carry a blade for so long that it begins to feel like a hand he cannot live without. But even a man who has learned to walk carefully so as not to wake sleeping children, and I had learned, knows that there are ways of touching the world that are gentler and that demand perhaps more courage than the clash of arms. I held the sword by its scabbard and felt the weight of all that had been done and all that had not. The leather was smooth where my belt had polished it, rougher at the stitching. My breath lifted a little. The chapel held that sound and made it quieter. Beyond the open door, I saw the dark green of the beach, and beyond that a sliver of horizon, pale as a blade of hammered silver, where the ocean lay. "This is the place," I said, not to anyone in particular, but the words folded into the room, and I knew they would sit in the stones, the way warmth sits in bread. Eliduc stepped forward until she stood beside me. Eliduc came to my other side, her fingers finding the edge of my sleeve, as if to remind me of the ground beneath my feet. I did not need reminding. The floor was firm, the walls did not sway. Still, their presence bracketed me, like quiet bookends. Brother Alan moved to the threshold and leaned his shoulder against the wood, so that we were not entirely alone, and not entirely watched. The smallest of smiles rested on his mouth. He had tied the end of the bell rope to a simple carved toggle. It hung from the rafters, like a line drawn by a careful hand. I lifted the sword and laid it on the altar. There was no sudden music, no stroke of sun. The candle whispered. The sea exhaled. A robin at the little window cocked its head and then flew away with a tassel of grass in its beak. My hands were light in an unfamiliar way, as if I had been carrying water and had finally set the bucket down. I felt in the chest something unclench so gently that I nearly mistook it for a breath. "I will not take it up again," I said. The words were not oath enough to satisfy a court, perhaps. They were more than enough for me. I did not think of battlefields. I thought of the smooth path that would need sweeping after rain, of the way candles guttered, if you trimmed them poorly, of the sweetness of bread when it has sat long enough with butter that both have softened. I thought of listening, truly listening to voices that came troubled, to birds in the eaves, to the white hush of snow when it falls at night. If there was a fight left, it would be with my own restlessness, a gentler struggle with no winner or loser, only a practice. Eliduc's hand slid into mine for a moment, brief as the touch of a petal, then it was gone. Eliduc's eyes held mine, bright but steady. Between us ran a river of knowing that did not need words. We had all been named by different names in different hearts. Wife, beloved, husband, friend, companion, pilgrim. The chapel did not ask us to choose a single word. It asked us to be quiet enough that the right one would come when it was ready. The candle's small pool of wax widened. Brother Alan crossed himself in the way he does when he is not thinking about it, and went to place his hand on the rope. He did not pull. The bell was not ready. Its metal would have its own first word when the hour came. He only let the fibre run over his palm, and smiled, and let it go. The men with the trowels set their tools in water, and went away without calling out. The day thinned. The smell of the sea tilted toward tar and kelp as the sun climbed, and then began its slow fall. We left the door propped with a wedge of oak so the air could move through, and the candle could breathe. Outside, the beach threw a dapple like an old cloak on the ground. Something small moved in the bracken with a sound like the thought of rain. I could not see it at first. Then a slender head appeared, black-eyed and bright. The weasel paused and looked toward the open door, as if testing the shape of it in the same way a man will test a new word on his tongue. It held nothing in its mouth. It flicked its whiskers and vanished, its body a swift stroke of ink in the green. We stood for a while longer, saying little, each of us learning the measure of the room and the road beyond it. When at last we turned to go, the wind lifted, and the bell rope moved of its own accord, a whisper of fibre, a suggestion. Tomorrow, I thought, the bell will ring, and after that other mornings will come, and the fruiting of the bracken, and the slow, certain passage of feet on the path, a fisherman with salt on his sleeve, a girl with a knot of questions in her hands, a widow bringing a sprig of rosemary, The sea will keep breathing, the sword will rest. Somewhere under the beach, in the softened earth, something small will go on living, quick and unseen, carrying in its mouth a bloom we have not yet learnt the name of. And so, dear knight, our story comes to a gentle close. Remember, every night brings another story, and every story brings another dream. Until we meet again, rest well and good night.